Hi, and welcome to the Law of Foho podcast. I am your host, Robert Foho, and I'd like to welcome my guest today, Pete Zaborszky. Pete is a serial entrepreneur, and he's the founder of Retalk.com. Pete, welcome to the show, and can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. So I'm like this strange combination of a tech entrepreneur who's not woke and isn't progressive and super left wing. So
I didn't know those
also
existed.
yeah, it's quite rare. That's what I've heard. So I was born in Hungary back when it was still occupied by the Soviets. So from my parents and my grandparents, I've heard all about living in an authoritarian regime. And then I grew up in the UK. That's where the accent comes from. And I guess over the last few years, I've become very, very concerned about what's happening, especially in tech and Silicon Valley. And about a year ago, I thought I actually need to do something about this. And I also think there's a huge market need for a new social network. So we created Retalk, and it's been running for about a year now.
What part of the UK did you live or grow up in?
Quite near London, a bit north of London, in Essex.
My parents are Cuban and came from Cuba in the early 60s and escaped that totalitarian regime. So we have that in common. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it gives you a bit of perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's how I learned. My dad is where I learned how to be a conservative, how to value individual freedom and protecting one's rights and liberty in general. That, and then listening to Rush Limbaugh in the car when I was a teenager, when he would drive me around from school or karate, what have you. Given your focus, I thought it would be particularly relevant to bring up something that happened to me yesterday. My last podcast episode, I distributed it on Tuesday, put it up on all the platforms, and then I usually post it on YouTube and Rumble. Yesterday morning, I get an email from YouTube telling me that they took it down. The podcast itself was focused on, I had Tammy Clark on. She's an industrial hygienist out of Michigan, and she's done a lot of talks, a lot of expert testimony, and particularly important cases concerning COVID-19 and the use of masks and the efficacy of masks. And we had a long discussion about whether or not masks prevent spread, whether there are any harms associated with the prolonged use of masks. And YouTube took it down because they cited that it includes misinformation, and the information, the content of it contradicts guidance from the CDC and the World Health Organization. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the core issues with moderation or censorship, is that there has to be someone that decides what correct information is, and it's I think in this case it's been absolutely ridiculous that if you go back, you could actually see how many things the WHO and the CDC have gotten wrong, yet somehow now they are the arbiters of truth in these topics. And if you say anything that contradicts them, then basically you don't have a voice on big tech. So it's pretty insane, because how can you say that something is an authority when they've got so many things wrong? I think the other really interesting thing on this is that when COVID was starting to spread in China, back when WHO and the Chinese said that it doesn't spread person to person and it's not a pandemic, blah, blah, blah. Twitter was actually going quite crazy, with many people saying there's something wrong here, something's different, there's a big problem, pay attention to this. So actually on the ground, on the grassroots, you could say, information was actually starting to filter through, saying there's a big problem here, when the authorities were still saying move along, there's nothing to see here. I think that's really the power of social networks, is that you do get information from the ground up, but that's exactly what they're trying to control now,
right?
Which is really bad, because that's exactly the type of information that would be useful, because you can actually get real-time information, but that's exactly what the people in power want to control now.
It's always seemed to me that the best way to arrive at the most accurate information and the most accurate consensus, if you will, is if people are allowed to talk and are allowed to exchange opinions and ideas. Traditional media, if you will, if you think of newspapers and the major networks, that was always controlled by certain authorities in power, and they controlled what information was conveyed. Social media has essentially decentralized all that, but now it's as if they're attempting to regain control of the flow of information on social media. What, if any, way is there to prevent them from regaining control of these different platforms and how information is shared on them?
Well, my hope and my theory, and one of the reasons I started Retalk is because I think I hope that we're in a phase, really. This is like a transitional period where there's a lot of things going wrong, and we can see a lot of things going wrong, especially on people on the right. But I think where there's a need, the market will eventually fulfill that need. But because these companies have become so powerful, and because they've got these big network effects, so everyone is on Twitter, everyone is on Facebook, so you have to use it. But eventually, I think if Facebook and Twitter control too much of what's happening and they don't give a voice to many people, other platforms will emerge, just like Retalk. And I guess that's my bet as an entrepreneur,
right?
Is that there's going to be lots and lots of other platforms. And unless you're going to create countrywide laws for all platforms, which I think in the US is quite unlikely, in the EU and other places, I think it could. There's maybe slightly more likely that it could happen. So unless you do that, if there's lots and lots of platforms, you have lots and lots of platforms, lots and lots of different rules for moderation, and hopefully you won't fall into this trap of just sort of Twitter and YouTube cutting people off at the bottom and information not filtering up.
Do you think it's possible for alternative platforms like Retalk? We now have Truth Social. There's as far as Twitter's concerned, there's Getter. There was Parler a couple years ago. I think Parler is still around, but I haven't used it very much. Is there is it possible for any one of these alternative platforms, or perhaps as a collective, for them to gain and achieve as much popularity as Twitter and Facebook?
Yeah, it depends, I guess, what you mean by as much popularity, because I don't think while there's many conservatives or right-wing people on Twitter, I don't think they're going to join Getter or other platforms. So I think what's more likely is that you're going to fragment the market, and there's going to be lots and lots of different platforms. And just like with traditional media, on social media, you're going to have different platforms for different political groups. Because, I mean, with social media, really, social media is about consuming and creating information, just like traditional media, really. And everyone wants to get information from people that they trust and people who think in a similar way. And I think that's why social media will also fragment, because everyone wants moderation, censorship, or just people on the platform who are similar to them. So if everyone gets censored off Twitter, or they don't feel like they can speak truthfully,
right?
My prediction is slowly, it's not going to be a quick process, because these old platforms do have a lot of power and a lot of network effects. But I think eventually these new platforms will grow, and there's going to be a lot more alternatives.
It seems to me like the market, as far as social media is concerned, is starting to resemble the streaming market. So, whereas you have the major networks and cable TV, and slowly over time we saw Netflix gain popularity. We saw all these other now streaming networks, Amazon Prime. We have Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, and so on and so forth. It's becoming increasingly fragmented. I think that's the right word for it. And I think the same thing seems to be happening with social networks. At some point, though, don't you think that that's going to somehow shake out, where perhaps the lesser players are going to either go belly up or out of business, and eventually you're going to have the user engagement is going to be, it's going to coalesce around one or two different alternative platforms? Do you think that's going to go that way at some point? Because we've seen that happen with streaming. I forget which streaming platform it was, the one that they would put out short movies or short episodes, and that one just kind of went belly up right away. CNN Plus obviously came in and went really quickly. So I feel like that's eventually going to happen with all of these different social media platforms. What do you think?
So there's a really interesting theory. I think it's called like bundling, unbundling theory. I think maybe they teach it in business school, but what generally happens in markets is you have these waves of when there's a few players, then you have unbundling where you have smaller players picking off small parts of the big players. So for streaming, that would be, you had Netflix kind of centralizing everything, but then now you have Disney picking off children's TV, then you have other, HBO picking off really high quality TV series. So you have an unbundling period, but then once that's kind of maxed out and you have lots and lots of small companies, then things start bundling again, and then you start centralization again. And you almost always have these waves of up and down in every single market. And if everything's really centralized, then the opportunities for entrepreneurs are in fragmentation. And if there's too many companies, then the opportunities for entrepreneurs are in centralizing everything. So I think you probably will see waves, but on the other hand, I think politics is such a strong motivator for many people that it's going to be hard to, once the cat's out of the bag, that social media can't be made kind of independent and is always going to kind of take a political stance. And I don't know whether that's what we'll find out with the whole Elon Musk thing, whether that can change or whether we can have an independent platform. And I'm sure we can talk about that. But if we can't, then I think you're more likely to have a fragmented market than not, just because people do group together in terms of their politics.
Elon Musk is a very, very interesting development with respect to Twitter. I thought I covered it in one of my past episodes when he initially purchased the first batch of shares that he bought, and then before he made the tender offer. I see it as the combination of two wonderful pursuits. One is, a very wealthy entrepreneur seeking an opportunity to create additional value and create profit for himself. But at the same time, that also generates a wonderful byproduct, which is making that platform more transparent and more open and just a better product all around. Do you see it that way?
Well, I think it's unlikely that things are going to get worse with Twitter if Elon takes it over. That's one of my main. I mean, I think in the last 8 years, probably ever since Trump emerged as sort of a presidential candidate, I think that's when things started really going downhill. And I think Twitter, but most of the other platforms have gone completely political and not just political really, but I think partisan, because the whole Hunter Biden laptop thing was a very, very partisan move. So things can only get better from here, I think, with a takeover like this. And the kind of stuff that Elon's talked about is really encouraging. And he's said multiple times about open sourcing the code, about always making it clear if a tweet is promoted or demoted, or making it clear if a Twitter staff member has done anything to a tweet. So just bringing a lot more transparency into social media, which is it's almost revolutionary, which is amazing that I have to say that, but it's and I guess that's the sad state of things, that it's actually revolutionary that we might have a social media platform that's fully transparent. So I think that's really, really good.
I always thought it always appeared that social media was fairly transparent until we started to see and learn about how their algorithms work. And from a certain perspective, I suppose I don't have that big of an issue with how, for example, Facebook's algorithm works. I had somebody else on a podcast a couple months ago. His name was Rick Cromie. He's an historian, and he made the point to me that if you consider how you interact with people in everyday life, you go to a party, you're not going to necessarily talk or socialize with everyone at that party. You're going to talk to the people that you know, that you're familiar with. If you go to the gym, you're going to talk to the same 2, 3, or 4 people that you normally see. You're not going to interact with everyone at the gym. Facebook's algorithm appears to, and perhaps the algorithms for these other social networks, they appear to mimic how we interact with people in everyday life. So on Facebook, I've done a little experiment on my own. I've gone and looked up people whose posts who I haven't seen post anything in quite some time, and I'll see that they have posted stuff, and I just haven't seen it. And I think it's because the way the algorithm works, it just shows me stuff that I normally engage with on a more regular basis, and that appears to mimic how we socialize and interact with people on a regular basis in everyday life. Do you agree with that, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think sometimes the algorithm debate gets a bit overblown, and the companies get a little bit too demonized. But I mean, we still don't know what's going on in the background, and it does seem like certain voices get the dial turned down.
Yeah,
and you'd never know if that really happens. Yeah, Facebook is interesting because it's all about your friends. So they try and prioritize content that's all about your friends. So that's obviously going to influence what you see, because they're only using that, you know, the net's only capturing what your friends are doing, and they're not serving you the most interesting content from the whole world. The other platforms in this case are a bit more interesting, especially TikTok, because it really focuses on showing you content that's the best content from the whole world that you're going to engage with, and it's nothing to do with your circle of friends or people that you follow. It's purely just about serving interesting content. And I mean, especially in that case, what the algorithm is doing in the background is really kind of critical, I think, to even what topics become big topics just in the general public, just what become the talking points in a society. So I think the less it's about specific people that you're following or your friends, and the more it's about the algorithm selecting interesting content for you, the more risk there is with the algorithm. And I think that's exactly why it's so risky that TikTok is basically being run by the Chinese government, because they basically fired the founders now. So so they've completely taken over. And are you really going to let the Chinese government control the talking points and the dialogue in your own country? I think there's massive risks there.
Well, judging by how the Chinese government controls what is expressed and conveyed in their own country, I think that there is enormous risk with that development. Tell me about Retalk. How is it different? How did you come to develop it and launch it, and what specifically is different about it?
I think the main thing about Retalk is that we organize conversation around certain interests. So it's a bit like Facebook groups, or if you know Reddit, then it's like Reddit. So we'll have separate groups for gardening, for motorcycles, for politics, and you'll be able to go into those groups and discuss those specific topics. So rather than kind of following people or following your friends, it's really about the topics that you're interested in. The other big thing for me is the whole issue around how social media encourages like really short form and potentially hostile conversation, because hostile and outrageous conversation is what really engages us in the short term, at least. And with Retalk, it's a small difference, but we try and encourage longer posts, more well thought out discussion, just to try and encourage slightly better debate and better discussion. So that's the other big thing about it. So those are the two selling points, I guess.
Right. I think it's interesting that you mentioned how you're trying to create an environment where there will be longer form discussions, because what I've noticed is that people, at least the general public, tends to gravitate more towards the short form dialogues, the quips, the tweets, you know, and so on and so forth. And I feel like that often prohibits a more meaningful exchange of ideas, and I think it lends itself to more of the hostile sort of discussion that you referenced. Have you seen that? Your attempt, your effort in trying to promote a longer form discussion. Have you seen that have any success at all with Retalk?
Well, we've had over 170,000 people sign up, and we get about 40,000 people engage with Retalk on a monthly basis. So there's definitely people looking for that. We do actually have quite an older demographic. The average age, I think, is over 50 for Retalk users. So maybe those kind of people are looking for longer form discussion.
Sure.
I also, maybe as like a personal, it's almost a bet or like an entrepreneur's risk. I hope that what's going to happen in the world is a bit like what's happened with say McDonald's in food, is that when McDonald's arrived, it tastes awesome, it's quick, it's everyone goes there because for these reasons. It's always going to be the same. But then 20 or 30 years later, sort of everyone's realized, well, I shouldn't only be eating McDonald's, and it's not the best thing for me. And there's been a conscious choice for people to maybe avoid or limit fast food. And I hope that that's going to happen with social media as well. I don't know if I'm going to be right, but we'll see. I think eventually, as time goes on, and it might take quite a while, but people will sort of slowly realize that I don't just need short form conversation. I've had enough of outrage. I've had enough of hostile discussion, and kind of more people will be interested in sort of longer form, well thought out discussion online as well. But there's already a market. I just hope it'll get bigger. Sure. And more people will appreciate it.
I think you may be right. I mean, the term Facebook expert took sort of a life of its own. And you see this whenever there's the new common topic of the day, or the topic of discussion of the day, usually then yields a whole host of new experts on Facebook who aren't really experts in that. We went from COVID experts on Facebook to Ukraine experts, and now we're transgender experts, and then now we are Elon Musk Twitter experts. And so when I review all of that content on Facebook, I usually come to the conclusion that none of these people are experts in any of these issues. So why am I even looking at this stuff? And I tend to decrease the amount of time I spend on Facebook unless I'm posting my own stuff. But I otherwise don't sit there and scroll through all that stuff, because most of those people don't know anything.
Well, they have strong opinions, but they might not have they don't have knowledge.
Yeah, they have very strong opinions, but they don't know very much. I think we have seen an interest in longer form discussions. I think Substack has taken off. There are a lot of people posting some really good content on places like Substack. And I've been on Retalk. I've used it myself. I created an account, and I have seen what you're describing. So I think I think there is certainly an interest in longer form and more meaningful discussions. I think probably one way to analogize it is when conservative talk radio took off. The demographic statistics that I would hear from some of, like, for example, Rush Limbaugh would or Glenn Beck would talk a lot about the demographics of his audience, and they tended to be an older crowd, more affluent crowd. Income levels were in the six figures. So I think that there's definitely a market for that places like Facebook and perhaps Twitter have sort of ignored by appealing to the lowest common denominator.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's quite encouraging then.
Yeah. How do you think Elon Musk will change Twitter? Do you have any thoughts about that? Other than the most obvious, he's already announced that he'll bring Trump, he'll reinstate Trump's account. Whether or not Trump starts using Twitter again is another question altogether. But how else do you think he could change it for the better?
Well, when Twitter was quite young, there was this dream in Silicon Valley that it could become like this, almost a protocol, a bit like email. So Twitter would provide the infrastructure for exchanging short messages, and they provide the infrastructure for following and friends and creating your sort of social graph. But developers would be able to build products on top of Twitter, and you'd, just like you have your email client or you have Gmail or lots of other email services, lots and lots of developers would be able to build things on top of Twitter. And I've seen many very influential people talking about this dream again, people who definitely speak to Elon Musk. So I think that could be a massive development, and it could be a massive new market where Twitter could almost become the infrastructure provider for building social networks, and hundreds, thousands, millions of developers could build products on top of Twitter's protocol. And that I think would be a massive change. And as someone who runs a social network, maybe I could find a way to integrate Retalk with Twitter and make Retalk even better. So I'm really encouraged that discussion's coming back, because I think that could be a massive improvement again to the social media market. I think Twitter leadership looked at Facebook and saw, how well the newsfeed is working and how well you can advertise in the newsfeed, and they basically closed Twitter off completely and turned it into another Facebook, or the newsfeed part at least. Whereas Twitter could have been something much more, and maybe that's going to happen. I'm very enthusiastic about whether something like that could happen, especially as a tech entrepreneur and a developer. There's probably some really cool things we could build that way.
What do you mean when you say, and I think it's interesting that what you mentioned, because I haven't heard that yet. What do you mean when you say that something like Retalk could be integrated or with Twitter, or use Twitter's infrastructure to improve its own platform? Like, what do you mean by that?
So probably the most important part of Twitter is the network of who follows who. And if they could, now obviously they want to hang on to that, and they're not going to want to make that, just give that away, because that's a massive value there. But if they can somehow sell that information without giving it to me, and let me kind of build Retalk into a better product, because I can use Twitter's knowledge of who follows who to make to kind of maybe lay that on top of Retalk. Something like that could be huge. And I'd, as a social network, I'd probably pay for Twitter to do that. So that could be one of the things. The other is the exchange of messages. I'm not quite sure how I do that with Retalk, but definitely some other ventures could probably emerge where Twitter would be, they just provide access to a messaging service, and you'd pay Twitter a very small fee per message or per group or per user, and Twitter would make sure that the messages are exchanged and where they're going, but someone else would build the actual app for messaging. That would probably be the other side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if Twitter went back to, or if Musk guided Twitter back towards, well, what I originally believed it to be, which was a platform for disseminating information in a very easy and a very, very quick manner. And I think that it's, as you mentioned, it's sort of lost that focus, and it tried to become what Facebook is. But if it was simplified back to that route, I think it would automatically be a much better product, along with promoting transparency and making it a little bit more open source, and obviously do away with the censorship. That's just asinine.
And I think maybe that if that happened, I think maybe a lot of people would start using Twitter again. So it might be a good market opportunity as well.
What do you make of all of these people who are pledging to terminate their Twitter accounts if Trump, sorry, not Trump, if Musk allows Trump back on, or if Musk implements all of these changes that he's talking about? I mean, where else would they go? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the same people who have been saying build your own platform for the last couple of years. Well, they can build their own platform, but I think I doubt if you don't like Trump, then don't follow him on Twitter. It's not rocket science.
Yeah, I never understood that. If you don't like something, just scroll past it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had people unfriend me back in 2016 and 2020 on Facebook, people that I've known for years, and they unfriended me because they thought that the fact that I voted for Trump twice, the fact that I supported Trump, or the fact that I supported whatever conservative or right-wing views I have, they thought that that was just too extreme. But I'll never understand why, if you just disagree with someone, why not just scroll past it? You don't have to engage it. You don't have to let it piss you off. I'll never understand that. And do you think we're going to end up in an environment where we have, I mean, let's assume, I can't imagine Musk is going to fail to make Twitter a better product. But let's assume that there's an exodus of users from Twitter. I don't think that's going to happen, but let's assume there's some exodus of liberal users from Twitter. Do you think that we're going to end up in an environment where you have right-wing platforms and left-wing platforms? And are we going to be seeing something like that?
Well, Twitter's a really, one of the reasons it's hard to answer that is because Twitter is it's become such a central platform, I'd say, for sort of the elites and the intellectuals. And because like every single politician pretty much is on Twitter, and many times, you know, politicians post some new news or something on Twitter first.
Right.
And I don't see how that's going to change. And I don't think liberal politicians are going to stop using Twitter and are going to start using another platform. Just like, even though Trump was constantly under attack on Twitter and he was always threatened with being banned, he still stayed on Twitter. So the network effects, I think, of Twitter are massive in that case. I think if the platform isn't actively censoring any views, then it's very unlikely that so many people leave that you get new platforms. I think what happened, you know, over the last couple of years to conservatives is why Getter was able to sort of get off the ground, because you couldn't actually discuss so many issues that conservatives wanted to discuss on Twitter. So you actually had to use another platform. I just don't see that happening to liberals. Even if Twitter is the owner, he's just going to let them talk about whatever they want.
Do you think that there should be any regulation at all of the kind of speech or the kind of content that is posted on Twitter or on any social media platform? Or should it be just fully open? Whatever anyone wants to post, they can post.
It's a very, very difficult issue. And my experiences from Retalk are that especially because on Retalk, we're trying to build communities. So it's not really about following people, but it's actual small communities of people. And for example, when you get someone who's actively trying to destroy conversation in a community, you can call them trolls, really.
Yeah.
They're not engaging in good faith. What do you do about that? I mean, it's like, in real life, if you create a restaurant and someone comes in and they're acting in a ridiculous way, the community, I think, should be able to say, we don't want that person in this place. But I mean, that doesn't mean that the person can't say something in another place, but they need to, they need to find their own community, or they need to do it alone, or they need to find their own place to go crazy.
Yeah.
So I think definitely the way free speech is handled from the government's part in the US is probably one of the best systems in the world. So I think the fact that it's in the Constitution that the government can't do anything about what you say about the government, that's a really, really good system. But when it comes to private individuals, I do think that the free market really should decide. And if the free market decides that in certain places you can control speech, fine. Just make sure that you can create new communities. But again, it's a difficult question because Twitter is so powerful and there's so many powerful people and influential people on Twitter. So in Twitter's case, I think you do need as little moderation as possible, because that's how free discussion can actually happen on Twitter. And it is such an influential platform.
I think that to the extent that we can get a platform like Twitter or Facebook or any of these other platforms to mimic how we deal with speech in everyday life. When we do have laws in place that regulate speech, and we do have, like, for example, in the United States, we have freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That you don't have, that does not deserve any kind of First Amendment protection, because that creates a hazard to other people. You cannot harass somebody. You can't call somebody 100 times and with no communicative purpose. You cannot stalk somebody. You cannot defame somebody. So there are limits to what free speech is allowed. I think to the extent that we can impose those same limits on social media platforms, I think that the result would be fine. So if, again, to use your example, if you have a community on Retalk where you have a troll who is just adding nothing of value, is harassing other people, insulting other people. If you owned a restaurant and somebody was doing that, you'd kick them out. And I think that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah. I think probably the root of the problem is that this is a really difficult problem, and there's like just sticking to the US for now. I mean, there's well, like 200 years of case law about all the difficult issues of free speech, where very smart people, very smart judges have made choices, and it's arrived at a fairly decent setup which works for many people. And then instead of using that, you have sort of 25-year-old programmers in Silicon Valley thinking they can do a better job, rather than 200 years of evolution and of very smart people deciding. And I think that's where it's just gotten really, it's very, very arrogant to do that, I think, to say that you can do a better job than the legal system. So yeah, that I agree. I think the more you can stick to the legal system, the better, because the legal system's that way for a reason.
I think what they often try to rely on is the notion that they're private companies. I mean, some of these companies are publicly traded, but for the most part, they're not government institutions. So they're not bound by the constitutional protections that attach to free speech. And so they're private companies. What do you think of that perspective that's often taken? Well, Twitter's a private company, so they can ban whomever they want. And in theory, they have a point, but is there anything, do you find any problem or any flaw in that argument?
In this case, I'm quite libertarian. I think if government gets involved, then it might cause more problems than it would solve. So I think in this debate, Elon Musk has kind of thrown a spanner into the works, because if Twitter would have carried on the way it was, these alternative platforms like Getter would have gotten massive. Maybe now they won't, but I do think, rather than legislating, I do believe in that these are private enterprises, and if they're going to do a bad job, eventually they're going to lose their market. Yeah, and you could see that happening with Getter. It's just that it's not quick, and I think a lot of the frustration for conservatives came because there's not an instant solution, and Silicon Valley was built over 20 years. You don't get an alternative platform quickly. You have to build those. Sure. So I think patience, and I think in the long run it's better to be patient and rely on the market to correct it. So I think, yeah, that in the end they are private enterprises, so I think that's a legitimate argument. It's just that in 5 or 10 years, you're probably not going to have a company if you screw it up too badly.
Yeah, I agree that to a large extent, the free market is the best tool for fixing a problem, or fixing or eliminating a business or an enterprise that isn't catering to what users would prefer to have. And I agree with you. Something like Twitter, if they continue doing what they were doing, other platforms like Getter, we're going to eventually gain a lot of popularity and a lot of engagement. I think the issue, though, where that argument sort of runs up against a wall, the idea that, well, Twitter's a private company, they can do whatever they want, is when these big tech companies take their cues from government or from liberal politicians about who should and shouldn't be censored. Because then what you have is what we had in fascist countries in the early 20th century, this relationship between large mega corporations and government. Corporations were doing the government's bidding in exchange for preferential treatment of some kind. That is a classic feature of fascist governments. That's where the danger arises with that kind of an argument. Well, we're a private company, we can do whatever we want. Well, no, not when you're taking your cues from the government and essentially implementing what the government wants you to do in exchange for some other sort of facilitation or favor that we don't know about. That's what I always found extremely dangerous when Twitter was banning Trump, when Facebook and Twitter were limiting the spread of the Hunter Biden laptop story. That infuriated me because they influenced an election.
Yeah, that's probably yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think at that point, probably the Hunter Biden laptop thing, I mean, at that point you stop being a private company because you are obviously getting involved in elections and influencing elections. So yeah, I don't know what the legal solution is there, or whether you know what you can do, but I agree that does cross a line. I think I don't know exactly how US law would work in this case, but I've been a bit disappointed that where there's been really, really obvious cases of collusion between the government and social media companies, there hasn't been any legal challenges. But I don't know how that would work, or if there's any rich billionaires who would want to take legal challenges on like that. But it just sounds like something that could be possible.
Well, I mean, there are two ways to approach it. One is, and I haven't followed this all that much, is it's somewhat in a situation like that where you have a large tech company like Twitter that censors somebody, and the argument is that they're essentially acting at the behest of the government. Then the person who is censored would have a First Amendment claim against Twitter, and there is case law that there isn't a lot of case law on this point, but there is Supreme Court case law that has articulated that very point, that when you have a company that's essentially an extended arm of the government that commits a constitutional violation, they are liable to be sued for that conduct. Another approach would be, do you follow Ron DeSantis at all, the governor of Florida?
Yeah.
He passed legislation, and I don't know a lot about it right now. I remember reading about it, but I didn't go back and look at it before we talked today. But he passed, or rather the Florida state legislature passed a law that he signed, which allows people to sue companies like Facebook and Twitter for doing that for engaging in that very conduct. And I don't know, I know that it was probably challenged by either by one of those companies or some other left-wing group. But that's another way to do it, is to pass legislation that essentially regulates these big tech companies when they try to engage in censorship like that. So I think there has been some effort, just not a lot. But I think Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter is the kind of free market development that we like to see to fix a problem like what Twitter was becoming.
Yeah. Although obviously, I think it has to be said, there's obviously another risk there where you're exchanging the risk of what Twitter was before to one person controlling Twitter now, and what he'll do in 10 or 20 years. But
True.
We'll see. But it's especially if the code is open source, then it's more transparent. As long as that's in place, I think that's guaranteed to be a better situation, I think. Yeah. So hopefully it'll be much better.
Where could people, so Retalk, it's retalk.com, right? That's where people could go find
We've also got apps on the app store, so you can just search for Retalk on there. Hopefully we won't get banned like Parler. Let's see.
Yeah, that was amazing, right? Parler was they were deplatformed entirely.
Completely coordinated attack. Yeah. Yeah.
This is just bizarre. I've never seen. I think it did coincide with Trump winning that election in 2016, but the energy and the fervor on that side of the aisle on the left became so just out of control, where all of a sudden a dissenting view is just not tolerated.
Yeah.
And
well, they started, I think, testing it with. I remember there were a few cases of conservative commentators who had their donations kind of cancelled everywhere simultaneously, and they were banned from PayPal, from Patreon, all these places where you could get financing. And I mean, those were super suspicious already. Like, why would independent payment companies have it like coordinatedly censor conservative commentators? And these weren't, Nazis. These were just right-wing people. But I guess it kind of culminated in what they did to Parler and in banning Trump. Yeah.
The individual I had on my last podcast, the one whose episode was taken off YouTube, when I alerted her to that, and she told me that she has been she's been very prominent in advocating against the use of masks to combat COVID spread. Her opinions are everywhere, and she told me that she was banned from YouTube, Google, PayPal, Eventbrite. PayPal canceled her account, stole her funds. Eventbrite canceled any event in which she's mentioned at speaking. LinkedIn will not allow her to have an account. Mailchimp canceled. So she's an executive director of Stand Up Michigan, an advocacy group. Mailchimp canceled Stand Up Michigan's email service. I mean, this is just, and everything she said, she cites. I'm not a conspiracy
theorist. It's just masks. I mean, it's not like
it's just masks, and there are numerous studies that conclusively well, maybe not conclusively, but there are numerous studies that establish that masks were not effective at preventing the spread of that virus. And if you want to have you want to disagree with me on that and talk about it, great. But just the outright censorship of an opinion that's based on many randomized control trials is just, I'm aghast at that. So retalk.com. Anything else you want to tell my listeners before we sign off?
Yeah, I mean, have a look at Retalk, have a look at sort of how it works, and there's a lot of political content on there, because I think that's one of the groups. A lot of people
communities. That's one of the communities. I've posted in that community a few times.
Yeah, but we're trying to sort of branch out to all sorts of other build all sorts of other communities around other things, from archery to firearms to.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. So you've got communities ranging from alcoholic beverages. That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Antique and classic cars. That's good. Dog show, fishing, football, gaming, gardening, camper vans, motorhomes, and RVs. That's an interesting one. No, so it's an interesting platform. I just started to get the hang of it, but I'm gonna try and use it a little bit more. It's just there's just so many now. So when you try and put out content, it's like you essentially have to now have somebody manage this stuff for you. But
that's what's hard about
dive into it more.
Yeah, from the perspective of someone building a platform, that's why it's so difficult now. Is there's just so much content to consume, and there's so many platforms kind of trying to get your attention. It's one of the reasons why it's quite hard to build a platform, but we're doing it. Yeah.
Right. Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Pete, for coming on. Thank you for your time. You're all
really
the way
enjoyed that.
You're all the way in Budapest. That's right.
Yeah.
So thanks for your time, and love to have you on in the future again if you're interested. We'll see how all of this stuff develops. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.